The craziest thing about the TikTok bill is that you have people defending it by saying there are thousands of people who run their businesses on TikTok. We can't shut it down. And I'm like, wow, the Chinese Communist Party has control over a large portion of American business. Wow, now I'm even more in favor of this divestment bill. They should not have that power.
See, that's I think a little bit unfair framing, given
if the Libertarians Party's position is that we should allow our foreign adversaries to have control over our market, our real estate, then the Libertarian Party is not a serious political party.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold. Where did it come from and where did it go?
Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Liberty Lockdown. This is Clint Russell. Thank you so much once again for tuning in. Just got back from West Virginia, or whatever state. It's a tri-state area of DC, whatever. And I did Tibcast IRL. I had a good time. A lot of people were concerned with the dialogue between Tim and myself. So I wanted to start off by kind of explaining my perspective on it. Same thing happened with Harrison Smith of InfoWars the following night. So I think Tim's in a bit of a rambunctious mindset right now. But you know, I still enjoyed the conversation. I think it's a very important one. I think that having a debate about the TikTok ban is necessary. Tim is a very influential figure, despite his detractors that would prefer he not be. He's got a lot of loyal listeners and a lot of loyal fans that are going to support and follow him in lockstep with his perspective on things. So I really wanted to use that opportunity to try and give the counter argument, and I think I did. Obviously, I'm not going to rehash all of it, but what I found fascinating about it is that Tim is willing, repeatedly actually, to acknowledge that all of the examples that I could present, Patriot Act and AMUF or AUMF, authorized use for military force, the NDAA, NSA, TSA, like all of these things that are proffered to the American people in a way that is very much downplayed as to the rights infringements that will be suffered by the domestic population. Every single time it is utilized against the American people. And he's willing to acknowledge that. I think at the end of the day, the truth is that he's just way more concerned about what TikTok represents and, the CCP. He's convinced himself that the CCP is a very significant threat to the American people, and that to have them in the propaganda campaign, even if it's not proven, because he wasn't able to prove it, because you can't prove it. You can't prove that they're actually modifying their algorithms specifically. I mean, he described it as a weapon of war, but I asked for evidence. He doesn't have any. He says, well, it's different output in China versus what it is in America. Yes, it is. But again, that's how algorithms work. Depending on the audience and the consumer, they shift. So we don't know. In fact, my thesis continues to be that they have nerfed the algorithm for their domestic audience, whereas they are allowing for the full might of delivering you whatever you want to be applied to whoever's the audience, whoever's the user in the rest of the world, because they don't care about what it does to them. They care about their domestic population. And I think that's the issue that I'm most concerned with is the domestic population, which is why I don't want to have the federal government have any sort of case law or examples of moderating internet content that is now legal, because what they did during the 2020 era was illegal. And I think that we're seeing, we've had courts, lower level courts, it's probably going to the Supreme Court to decide, or I think it is at the Supreme Court, to decide whether or not, it is at the Supreme Court. I just covered this last week. I forgot. Ketanji Brown Jackson, she was actually the one that was saying, no, we have to be able to. This is to defend the American people. No, Ketanji, in fact, it's very much the opposite. It's very dangerous to have the federal government have these parameters that are allowable. So I reject it entirely. I think that the important thing is that, regardless of the fact that I didn't get as upset as some people wanted, and I didn't yell and I didn't talk over Tim, that's just not really my style when I'm interacting with someone who I perceive to be my friend. I try and only and particularly when I'm a guest. I'm a guest on someone else's show. I'm going to try not to speak over them. And, perhaps, if it happens continuously, I'll have to change that perspective. But for now, that's kind of my goal. So I'm trying to get my message out there, but without being overbearing. And I know in the YouTuber, blood sports, shock jock type of world, that may not be to my best interest, career wise, but that's just who I am. I as you guys know, I started off the show doing a ton of interviews, and as a interviewer, I try never to step over my guests or step on. I try not to talk over them. I think it makes for the best conversation because the majority of my audience has been podcast listeners, and I want you guys to be able to listen to a good conversation as opposed to a scream fest. And sometimes, depending on your opponent, which in this case I didn't expect to have an opponent, but I did, they are not going to abide by the same rules, and therefore they have an advantage. And that's just, it is what it is. But, I enjoyed it regardless. As I said, I think that it was important. I think I got the majority of my points across. There was probably 30% of my points that I didn't get across because I just didn't get to speak very much. And that's unfortunate because I think that they are important. And I think that, that would have been the advantage of being more assertive and more domineering in the debate structure. So take it for what it's worth. That's my perspective, and this is how I approach things. I think that the bigger takeaway I had, and one that's very frustrating to me, is that I laid out my explanation for why I think that open borders is not to the benefit of not just the American people, but more microscopically the libertarian community. And I think that I have not received valid pushback to my thesis. And I don't know if it's because people didn't watch the whole thing or what, or if they're just going off of, basic principles and they're not willing to deal in reality. But it's very frustrating to me because I am sincerely concerned about what we're witnessing on our borders. And, I continue, I'll make the claim one more time and challenge you guys once again, those that are in my audience. And I know I have some that are very much in favor of open borders, the more anarchist leaning types that, think that it's a human right to be able to travel wherever you want, despite the fact that every nation on earth has immigration laws. And that's not actually how the majority of the world works. I will challenge you once again to contend with my argument that this is in fact a global government plot to try and, create global equity when it comes to poverty amongst the third world. And if you look at United Nations immigration, if you look up their plans, the recent ones that they've laid out, they make it quite clear that that is their perspective. I mean, that's their justification. Whether or not that's the actual, goal that they're targeting, I can't say definitively, but that is their claim. Their claim is that by allowing for the most poor of the world to migrate to America or to the West more broadly, the more developed, first world nations, that this is a way of creating global equity because it allows for the poorest to become more wealthy. And in some ways, that's true. If you come from Venezuela or even Argentina or any of the nations that have dealt with serious inflation and degraded economic systems, largely because of a deterioration of property rights, and you migrate to the UK or to America or to France or wherever, the quality of your life is probably going to increase because you are in a nation that does have, more respect for property rights. My concern with all this is that I don't believe, just as Rothbard, described in the late 90s when he realized that there was forced immigration, there was immigration plans that were being utilized by empires as acts of conquest, that we do not have to stand by and permit that. In fact, I think it's very naive to do so. And I'm not going to be quiet about this. And I'm not going to basically run from my analysis of this because I think I'm correct. And until someone can prove to me that the immigration rate has gone up 8 to 10x over the past 15 years in America, but also in much of Europe, and that's just organic. Until you can prove that to me, you have to then look at, okay, then why? Why is this occurring? And I think that there's enough evidence at this point that you have NGOs that are being funded through the United Nations. The United Nations has this global equity plan, and they are attempting to fund the migrants. And I don't think that that's something that the American people or the libertarian community ought to put up with. And then I think that there's a broader point that needs to be, challenged, and that kind of goes into Hoppian territory, or even LP New Hampshire territory, where it's like, do you value the American culture? Do you value the Bill of Rights? I know some people don't. Some people don't value the Constitution. They say, it's not worth the paper it's written on. And I've read Spooner. I understand the counter arguments here, but I think anytime that you're able to institutionalize or create structures by which libertarian perspectives become the law, essentially, that may not be the most libertarian answer. Obviously we would prefer everything to be voluntary, right? But if you have the choice, which oftentimes you are presented with a choice, particularly in a democratic system, if you have the choice between a system which honors bodily autonomy, just property rights broadly, or one that is more totalitarian or socialist leaning, your preference is almost certainly going to be the one that, statist is still more libertarian. And I think that the foundational documents of America, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, all of which are the most libertarian documents that have ever began a nation. And for that reason, I value them. And for the incredible track record of the American, not just economy, but the culture, one of embracing different cultures and bringing them in, but asking of them that they set aside any of their, foreign government model perspectives, and they embrace the American one that values property rights, one that values self-defense. And if you are now going to, instead of appreciate, cherish, and defend the American cultural framework, but rather offer to anyone on the planet the opportunity to come to America, regardless of their belief system, no longer demand that they speak your language, no longer demand that they honor the same things that you honor when it comes to individualism and self-defense, basically the entire Bill of Rights. Like, I'm just going to be perfectly honest. I am not interested in seeing, as long as we function in a democratic system, which I know it's a republic, but still there's votes, right? As long as we function in that system, I'm not tremendously interested in seeing tens of millions of people from all over the world come into my country, be offered either citizenship, through naturalization or a far-reaching amnesty program. I'm not really interested in having them all be given the right to vote, because it's going to go against the things that I value most. And that's just the truth. So if you're going to look at all of this, all of these things that I've laid out, and just say, everyone has a right to go wherever they want, and that's all you have to say about it, I think you're missing the biggest picture here, or the bigger one. And I know some people will say, no, Clint, you're missing the bigger picture. Everyone has a right. Okay. But just realize that all of those other fundamental rights that we value so much, the ability to defend yourself and property rights, like those are paramount, right? Well, if you offer to tens of millions of people to come in here and vote and change the framework of your civilization and your culture, then you are going to lose those things. And that is just true. It is true. And make an argument that it's not true. We're talking about marginal election differences of 3 or 4 points in most elections. Do you think, given that the Biden administration has been, thanks to a disclosure request, they have now told us that they have flown, I'm not even talking about the open border issue, but they have flown over 300,000 migrants to different cities on your money. In what world is that an open borders libertarian argument that you would get behind? That you think it's okay for the United States federal government to be paying for flights of hundreds of thousands of migrants and dropping them in cities all over America? Now, I don't know. In fact, I know for a fact that it is not disclosed which cities they're dropping them into. But I would guess if I was in charge of that program and I had if I was a Democratic operative, right, where would I be dropping them off? Think about it. I'll give you the answer. It would be in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and any of the other swing states out there. Right? And if that's the case, and you're talking about marginal differences in federal election outcomes, and you're also talking about some of these blue cities that are even without an amnesty program, are already trying to make it so that there is less and less barriers to being able to vote. Well, where does that go? It's a margin that is blown up by many magnitudes. And it creates uniparty rule. And now, whether or not you think that the Republicans or the Democrats are more of a threat to you, it doesn't change the fact that if one of those parties takes complete uniparty control, it's probably not going to work out for us long term. And now, I would argue that the Democrats are clearly a more existential threat to people who value freedom. And they are the ones that are largely orchestrating this plan to make it so that their election odds increase dramatically. And I reject any argument that says that we should applaud anything that helps them in that plan. And I think that it ultimately makes you a useful idiot if you choose not to deal in reality, if you choose not to deal with the actual arguments I'm making. And let me clarify one other thing, which I have not had an opportunity to do so. I think that immigration, broadly speaking, is a good thing. I think that allowing for those that are the most renegade entrepreneurial from all over the world to come here, if they, see, there's the pretext there, that's very important. If they want to become an American, I think that is a good thing. But it cannot be completely unregulated. And I know that's an unpopular thing for any libertarian to say, but you have to have some sort of, because, let me clarify, because we are an empire, because we have spent my entire lifetime blowing up God knows how many nations all over the world, you cannot have open borders and an empire. I'm sorry. I am not interested in being Rome. And at this point, many of you are applauding as Rome falls. Friend, you live in Rome. Okay? So you better be really confident about what comes next if you're going to applaud as that process unfolds. I, for one, will not. Everyone I know and love lives here, including myself. So I think that that's a very short-sighted perspective. And I know there's collapsitarians that say, well, fuck it. It's going to fall anyways, so why not applaud? Well, okay. Strap the fuck in. Good luck. Because it's so hard to get these types of ideas enshrined in law, in any nation, in human history, I think you ought to be very hesitant before you applaud its demise. Let me make that super clear. You ought to be really hesitant before you applaud the demise of the government that was the most hard-fought and rare to be structured in human history, and oh might I add, it also happens to be the most in alignment with a libertarian framework. I will not cheer as it falls. Now let's migrate into why this is such a big problem on the empire. Oh, let me, before I do that, I just want to answer one other thing. The reason that this entire conversation came up, besides the fact that I talked about it on IRL, is that there was a ruling from a lower court, I think it was in Philadelphia, that said that a man who had no criminal record, but he was an illegal immigrant, he had been charged with a gun crime, or just a gun charge, possession. And the judge, surprisingly, because it was in a Democratic city, said that, this is constitutional. Everyone has a right to self-defense. I agree with the ruling. Let me make that also very clear. I do think that it is a human right. It is God-given that you do not get the right to defend yourself from the state. You have that right. That's the entire framework of the Bill of Rights. That is, these are rights that we have that are outside the purview of the state. Simply, the Bill of Rights is declaring that the federal government cannot infringe on any of these things. So I agree with the ruling. The issue, and the reason I am also still not applauding, is because we have tens of millions of people that are here that are considered illegal immigrants that are now able to legally possess a firearm. Now, will most of them be good, upstanding people that won't harm anybody? Yes, because immigrants, by and large, are much like American people in that they will not harm others if they have a firearm. Great news. Bad news. Here's the bad news. A small percentage of them are here for really bad reasons. And a small percentage of them will hurt people, the domestic population, really badly. And if you applaud as they are now able to own firearms without having any additional conversation about why this is a globalist plan to flood the first world with third world immigrants, well, then you don't come across as a sane person. You don't come across as someone who's dealing in reality. And I think that that's more than anything what I'm encouraging the libertarians out there to do, is to speak to the broader perspective as opposed to being simplistic. It's weird that I even have to say that, because you guys are usually so good about analyzing, the entire chessboard as opposed to one pawn maneuver. But in this particular topic, I think it's because many of you are devoutly open borders. You're hesitant. You're resisting the necessity of digging deeper. And that is all I'm asking of you, regardless of whether you come to the same conclusion that I do, that legal immigration ought to be increased while illegal immigration ought to be brought down as close to zero as possible. Even if you don't come to the same conclusion, while making your arguments for open borders, I think it's very important that you clarify that you are also aware that the rate of illegal immigration in this country has gone up exponentially over a very short period of time. And do you have any answer for that at all? Or is it just, that's a good thing and that's all you have to say about it? Because if that's the case, well then okay, but no one's going to take you seriously, nor should they. Because you're not speaking to them about very sincere concerns that they have. And honestly, you're not dealing with the concerns that I have. So I think it's going to basically make you irrelevant in the political conversation in the nation. And that's your choice, if you want to go that route. And that is not proof that I'm correct either, for the record, because for decades of my life, drug legalization was considered completely outside of the purview of, the Overton window allowable discussion, however you want to frame it. But it didn't change the fact that I was still adamantly pro-drug legalization. But I think this is also a good example that translates basically it fits very well into the same argument I'm having about immigration. Because while we have argued for drug legalization for a long time, or at least decriminalization, we have also been smart enough, I hope, to say that having Soros-backed DAs who decrease crimes or decrease punishment and prosecutions, which is the most important part, for violent crime or property crime in your city, while also reducing the amount of drug charges, is not what we are prescribing. And if you don't make that clarification, then there's going to be a lot of people, the Cernoviches of the world and the conservatives of the world, that go, you got what you wanted, and look at the crime rates, look at the homelessness, look at the drug addiction. Because Oregon, Portland and San Francisco and all these cities that are doing both of these things simultaneously, that is not what we would prescribe. It is not, I hope. I hope we're on the same page on this one. You have to honor property rights. You have to honor and prosecute those that harm innocent people. And if you don't do that while legalizing drugs, the city, the culture, as everything is going to degrade very rapidly. In which case, people are going to do what? They're going to demand that there be additional charges and harsh treatment of drug addicts. So we regress to the 1980s and the war on drugs. Well, I hate to break it to you, but that's the exact same thing that is going to happen when it comes to the border and the immigration issues. Is that if you are not going to have a serious adult conversation about why the rate of immigration has gone up 10x and start talking about defunding the United Nations, which is funding the NGOs, which is making this happen. If you're not going to have all of those conversations, well, when an immigrant inevitably harms someone from the domestic population, which is already happening, I might add, of course, it always does. But when it starts to increase, the rate starts to increase, and the grievousness of the injury starts to increase, what you're going to see is someone like Donald Trump be elected arguing not just on closing the border, but also on decreasing legal immigration. So if you value immigration, I think it behooves you to have a more well-rounded argumentation as to what's happening and ultimately what you would like to see in the world. And if you don't do that, then you're going to get the worst of both worlds. Not an ad read here, just an offer for those that are interested in supporting the show and improving the quality of my production. You have an opportunity to do so. I created a GoFundMe so that you can help get a camera, because the camera I'm trying to get is extraordinarily expensive. It's like almost $2,000. And I realized that is way too much to ask of any single viewer, fan of the show, supporter of my work to throw down for something like that. So if you'd like to just throw a small chunk of change towards it, hopefully collectively we can generate enough to grab the camera. As I said before, yes, I could come out of pocket for it, but no, I don't want to. Because I do all of this work for free, or damn near for free, and I know you guys have enjoyed years of free content and analysis, and I spent a crazy amount of time doing the research necessary to do these shows. So if you would like to, feel no obligation whatsoever, but if you would like to, that's how you can do it. I will link below so that hopefully collectively we can come together and make me look not terrible. Thank you. So I invited Tom Woods on the show to discuss the border issue, and we'll see if he's available later this week, and hopefully we can dive a little bit deeper. I'd like to be able to both steelman and dismantle the argument on both sides so that we can hopefully have a more well-rounded approach to this topic. I hate to be in a position of sounding as if I'm lecturing anybody, and I think that if there's anybody that should be lecturing others, it would be Tom Woods. Speaking of another one of my heroes, Dave Smith had a hit piece written in part about him just today from the Daily Beast. Let's get into it. Comedians line up to help RFK Jr.'s misinformation campaign. At a Washington, D.C. rally in January 2022, the anti-vaccine activist Robert F. Kennedy Jr. drew an interesting comparison between COVID-19 vaccine mandates and the Third Reich. Even in Hitler's Germany, you could cross the Alps to Switzerland, he said at the time. You could hide in an attic like Anne Frank did. It didn't go well for him. Kennedy's comments earned condemnation from the Auschwitz Museum and his own wife, actress Cheryl Hines, who described his invocation of the Holocaust as reprehensible and insensitive. As Vice reported, this was far from the first time he likened vaccines to the systemic murder of 6 million Jews. Among those unbothered by the comparison, however, was his old friend Mike Binder. Time will prove him right, the comedian and filmmaker wrote on Twitter, calling for his fellow comics to spread Kennedy's message. Use your platforms. It's not too late. Have Bobby on your shows ASAP. Read his book. Read that speech. And please pass this on. For the record, I'm not familiar with Mike Binder. And I don't think that he was the reason that people decided to have him on their podcast. But I could be wrong. 2 years later, Kennedy is running for president, and Binder's peers have risen to the challenge, starting with a controversial interview on the Joe Rogan Experience last June, in which Kennedy falsely argued that vaccines cause autism. The candidate has wholeheartedly embraced the power of comedy podcasts to reach young, disaffected voters, as Media Matters reported in February. He sees them as a vital part of his strategy. This year is going to be the political campaign that will be decided on by podcasts, he told Jordan Peterson last year. I think the podcasts have the capacity this election for reaching people and allowing, sort of dissident and insurgent candidates like myself to end run the corporate media monolith. That's certainly a big factor. Whether or not it's enough to win an election, I don't think so. But it's a huge leg up to the more independent, less owned political candidates for sure. Continuing. The man knows his audience. In keeping with his misinformation-laden appearance on Rogan's show, Kennedy's end run of mainstream media has largely hewed to a corner of the comedy world where deadly conspiracy theories are just another form of free speech. Well, yeah, that is still a form of free speech, Daily Beast. His strategy reflects his own willingness to align with right-wing media figures and their audiences, and perhaps, more importantly, the increasing purchase of right-wing ideology in the comedy industry. I love that framing. No, the comedy industry is not going more right-wing. Y'all have lost your minds. That's if you think Rogan's a hard right-winger, you're totally crazy. From Rogan to Bill Maher, Kennedy's hosts have been a who's who of comedy's biggest cranks. Oh, goodness. It just so happens that some of them are also incredibly popular artists with highly engaged fan bases. There's Andrew Schulz, who in his 2020 Netflix special blamed the pandemic on dirty Chinese people, and in 2021 persuaded a Los Angeles theater to waive its vaccine requirements for his shows. Well, part of that was a joke. The other part was just being cool. Continuing. There's Tim Dillon, the former subprime mortgage broker and current 9/11 truther, who has lately embraced the white nationalist great replacement conspiracy theory. Hosted Alex Jones, praised the white nationalist writer Steve Saylor, stoked the moral panic over trans people, and questioned the efficacy of da-da-da-da-da. He was also banned from Airbnb in 2021 for threatening to burn down his host's home over a cleaning fee, but that's neither here nor there. Tim Dillon is so funny. There's Dave Smith, the anti-vaccine Libertarian Party activist. Interesting. So now the entire Libertarian Party is anti-vaccine? Because that's actually not at all accurate. At all. We're against force broadly from the government. We're just against that. So they start with a lie. There's Dave Smith, the anti-vaccine Libertarian Party activist who has also embraced the Great Replacement theory. I don't think he has. Praised Nazis. Definitely not. Demonized trans people. Maybe jokingly. Argued that drunk sex can't be rape. That's not what he did. And said that American Jews should be grateful to the United States for allowing them to flourish. I don't know why you shouldn't be grateful to your nation if it allows you to flourish, but okay. Jesus Christ. Dave, I'm sorry, buddy. Man, this is such a hit piece. Continuing, there's Theo Vaughn, who recently sat down for amiable chats with Tucker Carlson, featuring misinformation about the polio vaccine, and a former Border Patrol chief featuring violent anti-immigration rhetoric. Kennedy has even found a friendly ear in Whitney Cummings, the Two Broke Girls creator who has spent recent years arguing that comedians are supposed to be scumbags. She's right. And who lived up to her promise by mocking trans women in her latest stand-up special. I love that. Nice insinuation, calling her a scumbag without doing so. Very nice. In some of these conversations, Kennedy savvily frames his reputation as an anti-vaxxer in terms that comedians are sure to appreciate as a form of cancel culture. That was the label that was put on me to censor me, to silence me, to discredit me, he told Tiger Belly's Bobby Lee, a comedian who spent the last decade claiming to have raped a crying child prostitute in Tijuana. Then last year said it was actually all a joke. Oh my goodness. Vaccines, like other medicine, if they work, I'm for them, Kennedy added. But let's make sure they properly tested both for safety and for efficacy. Let's make sure that we know that the product is not causing more problems than it's averting. Oh man, what a controversial figure. In Kennedy's conversation with Tim Dillon, who in 2022 interviewed the alleged rapist and human trafficker Andrew Tate in Romania, he described the anti-vax label as pejorative, intended to marginalize and silence him. Well, that's literally what you're doing right now. So yeah, I think that's fairly apt description, no? Despite his efforts to distance himself from his reputation, Kennedy hasn't exactly shied away from spouting anti-vaccine misinformation. In that same conversation with Dylan, he argued that a litany of chronic issues became ubiquitous around 1989 when the vaccine schedule exploded, a claim he also made on comedian Adam Carolla's podcast, and asked why the NIH isn't funding research into what is causing the autism epidemic. We might be over-vaccinating people, Dylan agreed. On Vaughn's This Weekend podcast, he agreed with the host's false claim that the polio vaccine ended up giving cancer to a lot of women. On Howie Mandel's podcast, he insisted he's not anti-vaccine before acknowledging that he never got the C19 vaccine and falsely claiming, again, that vaccines cause autism. I'm not saying all autism is caused by vaccines. I'm saying that the vaccines definitely, are largely responsible for the epidemic that we saw begin in 1989. He made the same argument to Bill Maher, who agreed that his position is not unreasonable. Some comedians have been content not to discuss Kennedy's anti-vaccine stance at all, whether because they're unconcerned with it or because they agree. Dave Smith hosted Kennedy on his Part of the Problem podcast to debate his position on Israel. You're so great on Ukraine, and you're so great on the vaccine. Why can't you be great on this too? Andrew Shaw, why? Good question, Dave. Andrew Scholes and Akash Singh, the host of Flagrant, mostly prodded him about corporate influence in American politics, conspiracy theories about the assassination of his father and uncle, and Kennedy's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, which Kennedy has explained by pointing out that he actually associated with lots of sexual abusers. That's not entirely untrue. He did kind of say that, which was nuts. He said he was friends with OJ too. That said, at one point, he did claim that the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices profits from making people sick. Theo Vaughn mostly stuck to questions about his other campaign positions, while Bobby Lee mostly asked about his relationship with Cheryl Hines, who also appeared on the episode. Cummings only touched the vaccine issue in a rambling pre-interview speech that concluded with the message, "Let's be honest with ourselves. No one knows anything." Yeah, I think that's kind of fair. Cummings' monologue reflected a popular anti-intellectual strain in contemporary comedy, an art form full of professional talkers who believe they shouldn't be held responsible for anything they say or do. No, I'm pretty sure they all believe that they should be held responsible for things they do. The things they say is where we get into dangerous waters. Goodness gracious, I hate this stuff. There's too many variables to know, she said a minute later. Don't blame me. And for the record, I don't think that's anti-intellectual. It's called humility, to say that we're not sure about things. She says we don't know anything. Okay, maybe a little hyperbole, whatever. It's only natural that the stigma against spreading anti-vaccine misinformation would register as woke dogma, especially in the wake of a pandemic that had a radicalizing effect on many comedy professionals. Asked perhaps for the first time in their careers to consider a greater good, they ended up negatively polarized against the basic idea of public health. My God, what a line. It's only natural that, I'm going to read it again. It's only natural that the stigma against spreading anti-vaccine misinformation would register as woke dogma. Now, I mean, where you really ran afoul of the comedy community was with the mandates. I mean, I don't think they enjoyed any of it, the lockdowns, none of that. But the mandates is where it really galvanized the opposition. So to say that this would register as woke dogma, I think is totally strawmanning the opposition. Continuing, especially in the wake of a pandemic that had a radicalizing effect on many comedy professionals. As perhaps for the first time in their careers to consider a greater good, they ended up negatively polarized against the basic idea of public health. No, it was the force aspect that polarized them, friend. As the Los Angeles Times reported last month, a comedy benefit for Kennedy's campaign featured jokes about lockdown masking, Biden's age, the pathetic Democrats, and more masking. What's wrong with that? That was a big aspect of the past 4 years. Comedians tend to joke about topical matters, so it would be weird if they didn't do that, actually. Continuing. Given the reality of Kennedy's electoral prospects, it may be tempting to laugh off his podcast blitz as a shameful but ultimately trivial development. Unfortunately, the opposite is true. Dun dun dun. If we understand his campaign not as a serious bid for the White House, but as a means of spreading his particular set of beliefs, it becomes clear that his strategy is already a wild success. The danger is not that comedians might deliver him the power to prosecute medical journals, as he's promised in a campaign ad, but that their fans might hear what he has to say and believe it. As the writer Hamilton Nolan argued last year, the moral calculus here is very simple. The more people reject vaccines, the more people die. Sooner or later, the comedians who lent Kennedy their platform will have blood on their hands, if they don't already. My God. And that is from Seth Simons. I should have known. That guy is such a loser. Ugh. Well, there you have it. Sorry, Dave. You're going to have blood on your hands very soon. No one has blood on their hands for advocating on behalf of the mandates, though. Nope. None whatsoever. Nothing but sunshine and rainbows on the other side of your argument there, Seth. It's so frustrating to have people talk like this. But I still don't want him censored. Notice that? Notice that I don't want him deplatformed or censored. I just think that he's an idiot. It's the difference between Seth and all of the people that he listed. Some of the most brilliant, hysterical people in the world right now. Bobby Lee and Theo Vaughn, Dave, Tim Dillon, absolutely brilliant comedians, and might I add, very good political commentators, some of them being great. And I think that ultimately at the bottom of this, as is almost always the case, is a tremendous amount of envy. Absolute fury from the Seth Simons types that they can't possibly get even a Vivek Ramaswamy on their show, God forbid. Can't get, RFK Jr., they're platforming him. Oh, but he won't do your show now, will he, Seth? No, he won't. Just envy. Tim Dillon is selling out amphitheaters. He makes tens of millions of dollars per year, much of which just from his listeners alone who support his work because they love what he has to say, as unruly and uncensored as it may be, as wrong as it may be at times. They have real audiences, something that Seth shall never possess, because it is strictly about dragging others down, never creating for yourself. And I think that's really what this is largely about. But setting that aside, the argumentation is all flawed. If you just look back through the last 4 years and you analyze who got more things right and who got more things wrong, it was the shit-talking, idiot, 80 IQ comedians that knocked it out of the park. I'm being hyperbolic. Most of them are actually very smart. But from Seth's perspective, he would describe them all as mouth-breathing imbeciles. But they got it right. Not all of it, but they got more of it right than Seth Simons did. They got more of it right than many of the scions of health got it. So it's just laughable that you would portray this as a negative, that you have a bunch of independent thinkers that have on one of the first presidential candidates in my lifetime that's polling in double digits, that tells the truth about topics that you're not permitted to at all. Maybe not in my lifetime, but one of the only. He's definitely pushed the Overton window on a number of issues that I'm appreciative of. Not the least of which is Ukraine, which is extraordinarily important. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news, Seth, but we're on the verge of World War III. Wouldn't it be nice if we can have some additional options as to who will be the CEO of America that isn't totally gung-ho to launch nukes this, on February 1st or whatever day it is that they get inaugurated. So yeah, this is pathetic, ridiculous, absurd, and laughable, and embarrassing, deeply embarrassing. And what bothers me more than any of that is that, once again, Seth, being hard lefty, lunatic, as he's writing in the Daily Beast, they hate free speech. They hate it with every fiber of their being. Just as we covered last week with the Supreme Court Justice in Ketanji Brown Jackson. They don't, this entire argument about mis and disinformation is about censorship. Does the government have the right to censor you, or does it not? And according to the First Amendment, the answer is clear. They do not. But because the Overton window has successfully shifted over the past 4 years, this is now a dispute. This is now a topic worth debating. And I will once again reiterate, double, triple, quadruple down. The answer is very simple. No, you cannot. You cannot censor us. And, might I add, you cannot use third parties to do things that otherwise would be unconstitutional. It is also unconstitutional. And I hope that the Supreme Court will come down with a proper finding that, in fact, what they did was illegal. And then I hope that some savvy go-getter DAs, prosecutors across the country, decide to launch lawsuits, because there has to be a price paid for what they've done to the American people when it came to suppressing speech when it mattered most. This is the irony of the Seth Simons and Fauci perspective of the world, is that they believe that free speech is a fine concept, but it can't apply during a crisis. To the contrary, if there is ever a time it must apply, it is during a crisis. We have to be able to speak and think, most importantly, freely, on the fly, during a crisis, lest we be led astray, lest we fall prone to groupthink and all sorts of, negative consequences that become a byproduct of that process, lest we fall prey to propaganda, lest we fall prey to instructions that might be deleterious to our health. These are mandatory, not optional, that we are allowed to not just speak, but think freely. Because if you can't speak freely, you stop thinking freely. And I've suffered the same. Honestly, I have. It is a major challenge. I don't even know what I'm allowed to say on this platform. I don't know if I'm allowed to have read that article because of the nature of the claims made within it. Even though I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with any of it, I'm just reading the article. Well, I'm disagreeing with, the broader context as to, whether or not RFK Jr. should be platformed, God forbid. But more specifically, I'm not contending with the arguments within on COVID and all that. But I don't know if I can read it. So what does that mean? It means that it makes it less likely that I'll cover subject matters in this arena, which means that then I won't be thinking as much about these topics or if I am thinking about them, I'll be thinking about how can I say this in a way that is safe, whereas I would like to be thinking about the actual subject matter and conveying it to my audience of tens of thousands as to the truth of the matter or my opinion on the matter. But an opinion is now perhaps a dangerous conspiracy theory, which is censorable. This is all true. I have no idea if I'm allowed to have read that article. That's disturbing. Because I don't know if it's within or outside of the purview of, what's allowed. It's so frustrating. Anyways, continue to platform RFK Jr. Continue to. And I've been very clear that I think that his position on Israel-Palestine is reprehensible. But it doesn't matter. The only reason I know that is because he did Dave Smith's show. Because he was challenged and paused for 7 seconds when he was asked about, AIPAC influence in our politics. I know a lot more about RFK Jr. because of the podcast circuit that he's done. I know a hell of a lot about Vivek Ramaswamy because I've got to speak to him for approximately 3 hours. Spend multiple days, on his campaign or, covering his campaign. More dialogue, not less. I think that's to the benefit of our audiences, but just more broadly to society at large. And any attempts to stifle and suppress speech, I really do think is horrible. Continue to write your piece of shit articles, Seth. I enjoy it, I appreciate it, and fuck you very much. All right, let's get into just the last quick wrap up as to the attack on the concert venue in Russia. Over 100 people have tragically lost their lives, and there's a lot of dispute and debate over who was responsible. Allegedly, it was 4 primary gunmen from, I believe it was Tajikistan, or I think it was one of the stands. And they were, according to Putin and the Russian government, they were fleeing. They had been given a window to get back into Ukraine. No idea if that's true. I have no idea if any of the reporting on this is really accurate at this point. It's very early, so I just want to preface with that. But I think that there's a few things that are interesting about this. First off, Victoria Nuland. Yeah, our friend, our favorite State Department spokeshole. She had this to say.
With the $60 billion supplemental that the administration has requested of Congress, we can ensure that Ukraine not only survives, but she thrives. With this support, in 2024, we can help ensure Ukraine can continue to fight, to build, to recover, and to reform. With this money, Ukraine will be able to fight back in the East, but it will also be able to accelerate the asymmetric warfare that has been most effective on the battlefield. And as I said in Kyiv 3 weeks ago, this supplemental funding will ensure Putin faces some nasty surprises on the battlefield this year.
So to be clear, that was from a few months ago, and she has recently stepped down. I had hypothesized a week or so ago upon the news that she was stepping down, that perhaps that line, that there may be a few surprises on the battlefield, may have been why she was forced out. The fact that she would double down and say it again makes me think maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. I really don't know. But the fact that she says that there'll be a few surprises on the battlefield and specifically says asymmetrical tactics on the battlefield, it will help bolster those tactics. Well, what's more asymmetrical than terrorism? So I have no idea if that's what she was implying. I would be lying if I said that I knew. But it definitely raised an eyebrow when I heard her say it, and it raised an eyebrow double time after the news of a week ago with the tragic attack on civilians in Russia, in Moscow, or outskirts of Moscow. So I think that that's interesting. I think that there's another aspect that's interesting about this, in that there have been some commentators in Israel proper that thought that Russia has been supporting the Palestinians and specifically Hamas. I have no idea, once again, if that's true. But they said that Russia would pay a price. The commentators. I have no idea if this plays a role in the attack, but I think it's something that's interesting. I think what else is interesting is that the attack that began on Israel from Hamas, October 7th, was on a concert. The attack in Russia was on a concert hall. I don't know that that State Department or intelligence agencies do things like that to send messages. But I think that the fact that it was, both were concerts it's interesting. Whether or not it's correlated, I have no idea. It's a place of a large gathering, so it could just be, a coincidence of opportunity, but still something to consider. The 4 men also were, they didn't have the long beards that you normally would associate with ISIS fighters. They also were not, suicide attackers. They were obviously very much intending to survive and get away. Also, there has been reports that, I don't know if they're confirmed at this point, but there has been claims while these men are being tortured to some extent too. So you got to take with a grain of salt what they're saying at this point, because as far as I'm concerned, admissions under torture are not very valid, because you'll just say whatever to make it stop. But regardless, one or more of the alleged perpetrators of this attack have claimed that they were being recruited through Telegram, that they never met the people who hired them, they were sent I think it was something to the effect of like, it was like $5,000 converted into US dollar terms, and they got half of it up front. They were instructed on what to do. They had no name as to who was hiring them. They just got the money and they went and did it. Now, I have no idea. Again, I'm sorry I have to preface all this, but I'm just trying to be very clear as to what I know and what I don't. I have no idea if that's true. I have no idea if these guys are, radical ISIS terrorists and this is their cover story trying to save their own asses. I kind of doubt it. That's just historically not ISIS style. There's also obviously a much history from WikiLeaks cables that came out a long time ago that demonstrated that the Obama administration and just really the State Department, who cares about the administration? State Department was in part responsible for arming, funding, training aspects of ISIS when they were, arising out of Iraq. I think it was the Baathists, the ones that were kicked out of power, and they basically became the rebel group. And I have no idea if they've now gone rogue, if they're independent, or if they are still working under the purview of the CIA. I don't know. So, but let me add, there's also a ton of history when it comes to Syria. Syria is where ISIS really became strong. It was in part supposed to be used to take down Assad, the leader of Syria, but they committed horrific attacks. And then Donald Trump allegedly ended ISIS, according to him. I have no idea if that's true either, but they did have some bombing campaigns. I know that. And then they basically vanished for years. At least we didn't hear much about them in the West. And it seemed as if it was, their purpose had been ran through or run out. And now here they pop up. So let's walk through some of the incentives here. Like why would this be? Some people are also theorizing that perhaps Vladimir Putin and Russia, it's a false flag from their side, and it's used to justify a more aggressive attack on Ukraine. I don't think that, from what I've seen from the polls in Russia, the Russian people have wanted Putin to be more aggressive, and they've wanted this war to be brought to a close more rapidly. So I don't know that he would need that justification. It seems as if it would undermine him more than anything. And if you remember what happened after 9/11, it galvanized the American people under George Bush and it allowed him to go out and commit really heinous acts. But I'm not sure that Putin needed that, because he just won. He literally just won his election. But I guess that would be the logic as to why he would do it. But I just don't think that he needs that additional justification, that he would do that to his own citizens in order to get that justification. Unless he's trying to, then falsely claim that it's a wider NATO issue, and this gives him just cause to go after Poland or some other NATO territory. I've seen no signs that he actually intends to do that. So I guess that would be the logic. If he's going that route, then that would be the why. But again, I've seen no signs of that. So I kind of dismissed that one. I'm not sure though. I think that having Victoria Nuland saying what she said is probably the most damning piece of evidence as to whether or not America was involved. And let me just be very, very clear. I pray to God that the United States in no way was involved in these 4 men that were responsible for that. Because if they were, God help us. Because that is the type of thing that is a major, major escalation. And obviously civilians have been dying on both sides, and you have, a lot more in Ukraine because they're the defender. But this is an escalation, that kind of puts all of the rules of war, of conduct on the back burner, and they start to do really wild shit. So I'm very nervous about whether or not this escalates into a wider war. And, you know, Putin so far has been pretty reserved. I mean, as I said, you know, he could have been, like, over the past 72 hours, they have escalated their bombing campaigns against Ukraine, and there has been some targets in Kiev from what I've read. And I think that is, you know, that's an escalation for sure. But if you can escalate, that means that you've held back. Like, you could have been doing that the entire time. You chose not to. So my hope is that he will continue to be reserved and cautious. And I hope that the State Department or whoever is responsible for that attack will be held to account, because I think that there are certain aspects of, you know, rules of conduct in war that I would like to see honored. And this is why I've been so, you know, horrified by the Israel-Palestine conflict, because there's been attacks on civilians on both sides, really egregious ones. And I don't support that, because I think that if you're going to have war to allow the powerful in either nation to settle disputes, I would much prefer it be from those that have opted in, those that have decided to enlist, not the civilians that want nothing to do with this. And, you know, now we're seeing more civilians' lives lost unnecessarily and in a horrifying fashion. If you've seen the footage, I can't play it here, unfortunately. Well, maybe fortunately, I don't know if you want to see it, but really, really horrible act of terror. And I hope we can avoid getting American troops directly involved in a way that's, you know, brings us into a world war. I really do. Yeesh. What a scary time, man. I'm super nervous about it. Super, super nervous, because it just, on top of that, you have this, you know, incredibly dangerous economic time where every government, every economy, every corporation almost is so over leveraged. The entire fiat bubble is just at, you know, record lunacy. And simultaneously you have this globalist organization that talks about a great reset by 2030. And I'm like, I could totally see the economy resetting by 2030. I could totally see that. And then on top of that, you have the potential for a great reset with war. And you have, you know, these escalatory steps that are being taken that seem totally irrational and just crazy. And it's like, well, it's 2024, 6 years. That's kind of how long world wars take. There's your great reset right there. So yeah, confluence of factors. On top of that, the election year. On top of that, you know, stocks at all-time highs with inflation at the highest levels in my lifetime. Just a multitude of reasons for my nerves to be frayed. But I think that there's been very few people, I think, in America that are actually interested in war with Russia. A lot of them may talk about it, but I'm talking about like going and fighting. I don't think many people want to do that. And honestly, I don't think many people in Europe want to either. And honestly, I don't think many people in Russia want to come and fight us. So let's hope that the instincts of the people, not the leaders, are enough to prevent the leaders from leading us astray further. Let's hope. There, I found a silver lining to spin us into. I hate to end on a sad note, so that was my attempt to get us into a more positive framework. This weekend, I gotta let you guys know, it's up near Tampa. I can't remember. Go to samtripoli.com if you want to come out and see us. It's gonna be myself, Top Lobster, David, aka Raven, Sam Tripoli, live podcast. I think it's the 30th. Go to samtripoli.com to pick up tickets. If you're in Central Florida, make sure you come out. It'll be a blast. And yeah, we'll see if we get Tom Woods in here. I got to go do the show with Luke, so I'm going to run now. But please do hit the like button, leave a comment, share it around, and continue to support the show any way you can. Appreciate you guys. Peace.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold. Where did it come from and where did it go?